Sheriff Thomas Garrett received a call in September of 1971 that would change everything. Everything he thought he knew about the remote mountains of Pike County was about to be challenged. A traveling salesman, his vehicle broken down on an unmarked dirt road, had stumbled upon something that defied his comprehension, desperate for help. There, deep in the hollow, nearly 12 miles from the nearest town, he found a cluster of dilapidated wooden structures. And living within them were people unlike any he had ever before encountered. For over 130 years, the Blackwood family had resided in these woods, completely isolated from the world beyond. Their ancestors, led by Patriarch Ezekiel Blackwood and his sister wife Margaret, had fled to these mountains back in 1838, seeking refuge from a society that condemned their forbidden union. What began as two siblings escaping judgment was transformed into generations of closed bloodlines. It was a place where cousins married cousins, where uncles took nieces as wives, and where brothers shared intimate bonds with sisters, creating a genetic nightmare that would manifest in ways both visible and invisible. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. When Sheriff Garrett arrived on that autumn morning, the sight before him was something from a forgotten era. 17 individuals, ranging from infants to the elderly, lived in conditions that belonged to a century past. But it was not the poverty or the primitive living arrangements that struck him most deeply. What would haunt him for the remainder of his life was the physical appearance of the family members themselves. The children displayed severe cranial abnormalities, their heads misshapen in ways that suggested generations of genetic damage. Several adults possessed protruding jaws, a condition known as mandibular prognathism, making speech difficult and turning eating into a constant struggle. On some faces, eyes were set too far apart, while others had eyes that pointed in different directions, never focusing on the same point simultaneously. Limbs were twisted, spines curved at unnatural angles, and the youngest members showed signs of profound intellectual impairment, left unable to communicate beyond primitive sounds. Martha Blackwood, age 43, was the matriarch when authorities first arrived. She was the daughter of first cousins, the granddaughter of siblings, and the great-granddaughter of the original brother-sister union. Her own children, fathered by her uncle, Robert, who was also her second cousin, displayed the accumulated genetic burden of 5 generations of consanguineous reproduction. Her eldest son, Daniel, aged 19, could not walk without assistance. His legs were bent and weakened by skeletal abnormalities that doctors would later attribute to recessive genetic disorders expressed through repeated inbreeding. The family spoke a dialect that was nearly incomprehensible, a mixture of archaic English and invented words that had evolved in their isolation. They had no concept of the modern world. They had never seen electricity, never heard a radio, never witnessed an automobile until that September day. Their calendar had stopped in 1838, preserved in a time capsule of their own making, a choice perpetuated by the deliberate decision to keep their bloodline pure and untainted by outsiders. Sheriff Garrett documented everything he observed, his handwritten reports describing scenes that many refused to believe. He noted children with 6 fingers on each hand, a genetic mutation that had become normalized within the family. He observed adults with severe facial asymmetry, one side of their face appearing completely different from the other. He documented cases of profound deafness, blindness, and conditions that left individuals unable to control their own bodily functions well into adulthood. But perhaps most disturbing was the family's own perception of their situation. They did not see themselves as victims. They did not recognize that anything was wrong. To them, this was simply how families were supposed to be. Through broken and difficult speech, Martha explained to authorities that her grandfather had taught her that outsiders were dangerous, that their blood was poisoned, and that only by keeping marriages within the family could they maintain their purity and strength. The irony of this belief, given the severe genetic weaknesses displayed by every member of the family, seemed lost on them entirely. The medical team that arrived 3 days after the initial discovery was led by Dr. Harold Petton, a physician who had served in World War II and believed he had seen the worst of human suffering. He was wrong. What he encountered in those woods challenged every assumption he held about human resilience and the consequences of genetic isolation. He examined each family member, documenting abnormalities that ranged from the obvious to the hidden. Blood tests revealed severe anemia in nearly all members. Physical examinations uncovered internal organ malformations that should have been fatal, but somehow allowed these individuals to survive, albeit in constant discomfort. The youngest child, a girl estimated to be around 3 years old named Sarah, could not sit up on her own. Her skull had not properly fused, leaving soft spots that should have closed in infancy. Her eyes wandered independently, never fixing on any object or person. She made no sounds except for occasional whimpers when moved. Dr. Peton noted in his report that this child represented the culmination of genetic degradation, the end point of a bloodline that had folded in on itself so many times that viable human development had become nearly impossible. The investigation into the Blackwood family required piecing together a genealogical puzzle that defied normal comprehension. County officials brought in Sarah Mitchell, a genealogist from Charleston, to construct the family tree and understand exactly how this bloodline had become so catastrophically intertwined. What she uncovered was a document of horror, a map of human relationships that violated every biological principle of healthy reproduction. Ezekiel Blackwood and his sister Margaret, the founding couple, had produced 11 children between 1839 and 1856. Of these 11, 9 survived to adulthood. With no other partners available in their isolated homestead, these siblings began forming unions among themselves. The eldest son, Josiah, took his sister Prudence as his wife in 1857. Their brother Caleb formed a bond with their sister Ruth. The pattern continued across all surviving children, creating a second generation that was genetically compromised from birth. This second generation, born between 1858 and 1875, consisted of 23 individuals. Medical records compiled decades later would reveal that at least 8 of these children died before age 5 from various congenital conditions. The surviving 15 became the progenitors of the third generation, and they followed the same pattern established by their parents. Cousins who were also half-siblings married each other. In some cases, uncles took their nieces as wives when the age difference was minimal. By the third generation, born between 1876 and 1898, the genetic consequences were becoming impossible to ignore, even for the family members themselves. Infant mortality rates climbed dramatically. Of the 31 children born during this period, only 12 survived past age 10. Those who did survive increasingly displayed the physical abnormalities that would come to define the Blackwood family. Photographs taken in 1972 after the family's discovery showed elderly members from this generation with facial features that barely resembled typical human proportions. Silas Blackwood, born in 1881, was a third-generation product of sibling unions on both his mother's and father's side. He stood only 4 feet and 7 inches tall, despite both his parents being of average height for their era. His jaw protruded nearly 3 inches beyond his forehead, creating a profile that made eating solid food nearly impossible. He survived on porridge and soft foods his entire life. At age 90, when he was examined by authorities, Silas had only 3 remaining teeth, and his speech was so impaired that even other family members struggled to understand him. Silas had formed a union with his first cousin, Rebecca, who was also his niece through a separate line of the family. This relationship, incomprehensible to outsiders but normal within the Blackwood clan, produced 5 children in the 4th generation between 1904 and 1915. Only 2 survived infancy. Those 2, Marcus and Abigail, would themselves continue the pattern, with Marcus eventually taking Abigail as his wife when he was 21 and she was 17. The 4th generation, spanning births from 1898 to 1930, saw the genetic damage accelerate beyond mere physical deformities. Mental impairments became the norm rather than the exception. Of the 19 children born during this period, documented records show that at least 14 displayed significant cognitive disabilities. They could not read, could not perform basic mathematics, and struggled with tasks that required abstract thinking or planning. Their world became smaller and more primitive with each passing generation. Communication within the family evolved into something barely recognizable as language. Researchers who studied the Blackwood dialect in 1972 noted that it contained fewer than 800 distinct words, compared to the tens of thousands used in standard English. Complex concepts simply had no expression in their vocabulary. They had no word for tomorrow beyond next light. They had no term for grandfather that distinguished him from uncle or father, because those roles had become so interchanged that distinction was meaningless. The fifth generation, Martha's generation, born between 1925 and 1955, represented the culmination of genetic collapse. Martha herself was the product of first cousins who were also second cousins through multiple ancestral paths. Her genetic diversity was estimated by researchers to be equivalent to that of siblings in a normal population. Every harmful recessive gene that had lurked in the Blackwood bloodline since Ezekiel and Margaret had a significantly increased chance of being expressed in her and her siblings. Martha's brother, Uncle Robert, the father of her children, displayed a condition called microcephaly, where his skull was significantly smaller than normal, limiting brain development. Despite this, he was considered one of the more functional adult males in the family at the time of discovery. He could perform basic farming tasks, tend to animals, and communicate using the limited family dialect. By the standards of the outside world, he would have required constant supervision and care. By Blackwood standards, he was capable and strong. The sixth and final generation, born between 1952 and 1971, consisted of 13 children, though only 8 were alive when authorities arrived. The others had died from various complications, most within their first year of life. These children displayed the most severe abnormalities yet observed. Several had heart defects that doctors confirmed should have been fatal. Others had skeletal structures so malformed that growth beyond early childhood seemed impossible. Young Sarah, the 3-year-old who could not sit up, was not an anomaly in this generation. She was representative of what the Blackwood bloodline had become. Dr. Eleanor Phillips, a geneticist from Johns Hopkins University who examined the family in 1973, stated in her published report that the Blackwood case represented one of the most extreme examples of inbreeding depression ever documented in humans. She calculated that the coefficient of inbreeding for the 6th-generation children averaged approximately 0.375, meaning they had a level of genetic relatedness equivalent to what would occur if a parent reproduced with their own child. This was not a single incident of close relation, but rather the accumulated result of 5 generations of continuous consanguineous reproduction. Beyond the visible deformities and obvious intellectual impairments, the Blackwood family suffered from a constellation of hidden medical conditions that made their daily existence a testament to human endurance. When comprehensive medical examinations were finally conducted in late 1971 and early 1972, physicians uncovered layers of genetic damage that had been slowly destroying the family from within. Nearly every adult member examined showed signs of severe dental decay and gum disease. But this was only the surface of their oral health crisis. X-rays revealed that many family members had extra teeth growing in abnormal positions, some erupting through the roof of the mouth or growing sideways within the jaw. Others had missing teeth that had never developed, leaving gaps that made eating difficult and painful. The combination of malformed jaws and abnormal dentition meant that chronic pain was a constant companion for most Blackwoods. The cardiovascular systems of family members presented equally disturbing findings. Several individuals had heart murmurs indicating malformed valves, conditions that in a normal population would have required surgical intervention. One teenage boy had what doctors called a hole in his heart, a septal defect that allowed oxygen-poor and oxygen-rich blood to mix, leaving him perpetually exhausted and blue-tinged. He had lived his entire 16 years in this condition, never knowing that other people did not gasp for breath after walking 20 feet. Reproductive health issues plagued the women of the family with particular cruelty. Martha had given birth to 7 children, but only 4 survived past infancy. The other 3 had been born with such severe abnormalities that they lived only hours or days. She described through halting words and gestures babies born without fully formed skulls, infants whose organs developed outside their bodies, and children who never drew a single breath. These losses were accepted as normal, as simply the way things were, rather than recognized as the tragic consequences of genetic disaster. The family's isolation had also left them vulnerable to diseases that had been largely controlled in the outside world by 1971. When medical teams tested the Blackwoods, they discovered active cases of parasitic infections that had likely been passed down through generations. Intestinal worms were found in nearly every family member. Several adults showed evidence of tuberculosis, though whether it was active or dormant could not be immediately determined without further testing. Sensory impairments were widespread and severe. At least 6 family members were completely deaf, their auditory systems having failed to develop properly due to genetic factors. They communicated through a crude system of gestures and signs that the hearing family members understood. 5 individuals had significant vision impairments, ranging from severe nearsightedness to complete blindness. One elderly woman had cataracts so advanced that her eyes appeared completely white. Yet she had never received treatment because the family had no knowledge that such treatment existed. The skeletal abnormalities extended beyond the visible limb deformities. Medical imaging revealed that several family members had spines with extra vertebrae, while others had missing or fused vertebrae that limited their mobility and caused chronic pain. Hip dysplasia was common, leaving many individuals with a distinctive waddling gait. Some children had bone density so poor that simple falls resulted in fractures. And several adults showed evidence of bones that had broken and healed incorrectly multiple times throughout their lives. Perhaps most tragically, the neurological impairments extended into seizure disorders that affected at least a third of the family. These episodes, which the family called the falling sickness, would strike without warning, leaving individuals unconscious and convulsing. Without medical intervention or proper care, these seizures had claimed lives over the generations. The family had learned to recognize the signs and would restrain affected members during episodes, but they had no understanding of what caused them or how they might be treated. The psychological impact of this existence, while harder to measure than physical abnormalities, was evident in the behaviors and emotional responses of family members. Many displayed symptoms consistent with severe developmental delays and autism spectrum disorders, though formal psychological testing was difficult given their limited communication abilities. Social interactions, even within the family, were often strained and marked by misunderstandings. Emotional regulation was poor, with adults displaying childlike tantrums or withdrawing into complete silence for days at a time. Living conditions in the Blackwood compound reflected both their poverty and their disconnection from modern society. The family survived on subsistence farming, growing vegetables in small plots and raising chickens and goats. Their diet was severely limited and nutritionally inadequate, contributing to the stunted growth and poor health observed in all members. They had no indoor plumbing, no electricity, and no heating beyond wood fires. In winter, temperatures inside their crude shelters barely differed from the freezing conditions outside. Water came from a nearby stream, the same stream where they disposed of waste, creating a cycle of contamination that contributed to their parasitic infections and gastrointestinal problems. They owned only a few cooking implements, some handmade tools, and threadbare clothing that multiple family members shared. Personal possessions were virtually non-existent. The children had no toys, no books, nothing that might stimulate development or learning. Education in any formal sense did not exist within the Blackwood family. Knowledge was passed down through demonstration and repetition, limited to basic survival skills. None of the family members could read or write. They had no calendar system beyond observing seasonal changes. They could not count beyond their fingers. Their understanding of the world was confined to the immediate area surrounding their homestead, a radius of perhaps 2 or 3 miles that constituted their entire universe. Religious belief, which had originally motivated Ezekiel and Margaret's flight into isolation, had evolved into something unrecognizable. The family maintained vague notions of a deity and occasionally gathered for what might be called prayer. But their theology was primitive and confused, mixed with superstitions and misunderstandings that had accumulated over generations. They believed that outsiders were cursed, that the forest protected them, and that their way of life was blessed and ordained by higher powers. The evidence of their physical and mental suffering did nothing to shake these convictions. Leave a comment right now with the phrase, "the isolated bloodline that should have been found sooner." Let me know you're watching and that you understand the weight of this tragedy, ***. The discovery of the Blackwood family created immediate ethical and practical dilemmas for authorities in Pike County and throughout West Virginia. What should be done with a family that had existed outside society for over a century? How could individuals so profoundly damaged by generations of inbreeding be integrated into a world they did not understand? These questions sparked debates that continued for months after that initial September 1971 discovery. Initially, Sheriff Garrett and local officials hoped to provide assistance while allowing the family to remain on their property. Medical teams visited regularly, bringing food, medicine, and basic supplies. Doctors treated infections, provided pain relief for chronic conditions, and attempted to address the most urgent health crises. But it quickly became apparent that the situation was far more complex than a simple case of rural poverty requiring assistance. The family resisted outside intervention at every turn. They distrusted the strangers who arrived with their vehicles and equipment. They refused medications, not understanding their purpose and fearing they were poisons. When doctors attempted to examine children, parents became aggressive and protective, interpreting medical procedures as attacks. Martha, despite her limited communication abilities, made it clear that the family wanted to be left alone to continue living as they always had. This resistance created legal complications. Were these individuals capable of making informed decisions about their own welfare and that of their children? The children, particularly those in the sixth generation, displayed such severe impairments that any reasonable observer would conclude they required immediate and comprehensive medical care. Yet, their parents, themselves victims of generational inbreeding, insisted everything was normal and that no intervention was necessary. By December 1971, the situation reached a crisis point when 4-year-old Jeremiah, one of Martha's sons, died from what medical examiners later determined was a treatable respiratory infection. The child had been ill for several days, but the family had refused to bring him to the medical teams or allow him to be transported to a hospital. By the time authorities learned of the situation and arrived, the boy had been dead for nearly 24 hours. His small body, displaying the same cranial abnormalities and physical deformities common to his generation, was buried in a small family cemetery where at least 30 other graves marked the casualties of the Blackwood bloodline. This death forced authorities to act more decisively. In January 1972, a court hearing was held to determine the custody and care of the Blackwood children. The proceedings were unlike anything Pike County had ever witnessed. Family members were brought to the courthouse, many seeing a town and buildings for the first time in their lives. They were terrified and confused, unable to comprehend the legal processes unfolding around them. Martha wept continuously, not understanding why strangers were discussing her family and making decisions about her children. Judge Raymond Foster presided over the case with a heavy heart. He reviewed medical reports, listened to testimony from doctors and social workers, and examined photographs documenting the family's living conditions and physical conditions. The evidence was overwhelming and heartbreaking. These children, through no fault of their own, had been born into a genetic catastrophe that would affect them for their entire lives. They required medical care, education, and support that their family could not provide. The judge's ruling, delivered in February 1972, ordered that all children under the age of 18 be removed from the family home and placed in state care. This decision affected 8 children ranging in age from 18 months to 17 years. Adult family members, while encouraged to seek medical treatment and social services, were allowed to remain on their property if they chose. Most did choose to stay, unable to imagine any other existence. The removal of the children was traumatic for everyone involved. Social workers arrived at the compound accompanied by sheriff's deputies, prepared for resistance. The scene that unfolded was wrenching. Parents clung to their children, wailing in their incomprehensible dialect. The children, terrified of the strangers and unable to understand what was happening, screamed and fought. It took hours to separate families, and the emotional toll on everyone present was immense. One social worker later resigned from her position, stating she could not reconcile what she had been forced to do with her conscience. The children were initially placed in a special medical facility in Charleston where they could receive comprehensive care and assessment. Doctors worked to address immediate health crises while beginning the long process of education and rehabilitation for children who had never encountered electricity, running water, or even mirrors. Every aspect of the modern world was frightening and overwhelming. Simple tasks like using a bathroom or sitting at a table required patient teaching. Educational assessments revealed the extent of the intellectual impairments affecting these children. The 17-year-old Daniel functioned at approximately a 4-year-old level despite his age. He could not recognize letters, could not count reliably beyond 3, and struggled with basic problem solving. The younger children showed even more severe impairments, with several assessed as profoundly intellectually disabled and unlikely to ever achieve independence. Physical therapy became a daily routine for children with skeletal and muscular abnormalities. Some showed improvement with proper nutrition and exercise, gaining strength and mobility they had never experienced. Others, whose genetic conditions were more severe, made little progress despite intensive intervention. Young Sarah, the girl who could not sit up at age 3, remained profoundly disabled even with the best care available. She would require full-time assistance for her entire life. Dental work alone required months of treatment. Children underwent multiple procedures to remove decayed teeth, address infections, and attempt to correct some of the structural abnormalities in their jaws. The pain they had lived with for years was finally addressed. But the process of treatment was itself painful and frightening for children who had never experienced medical care. Social workers attempted to place some of the higher-functioning children in foster care, hoping they might eventually integrate into society. These placements were largely unsuccessful. The children could not adapt to normal family life. They could not attend regular schools. Their communication difficulties, behavioral problems, and medical needs overwhelmed well-meaning foster families. Most of the children ended up in long-term institutional care, spending their childhoods and adolescence in facilities designed for individuals with severe disabilities. Back in the mountains, the remaining adult Blackwoods continued their existence, now diminished and heartbroken by the loss of their children. Martha never recovered from the separation. According to later reports, she spent her days sitting in the same spot, staring toward the road where vehicles had taken her children away. She stopped eating regularly, stopped caring for herself, and died in August 1973 at age 45 from complications related to malnutrition and untreated pneumonia. Her death was ruled natural, but those who had witnessed her decline understood it was really death from a broken heart and broken spirit. Other adult family members slowly succumbed to their various health problems over the following years. Without children to care for, without the structure and purpose the family had provided, they simply faded away. By 1980, only 3 Blackwood adults remained alive. All elderly, all suffering from multiple health conditions, all living in the same primitive conditions that had defined their family for over a century. The property itself became a subject of morbid curiosity. Journalists, researchers, and even tourists attempted to visit the site, hoping to see the place where such a tragic family drama had unfolded. Local authorities eventually posted the land as private property and discouraged visitors. But the Blackwood story had entered local legend, whispered about in surrounding towns as a cautionary tale about isolation and the dangers of keeping bloodlines too close. The Blackwood case became a turning point in understanding the long-term consequences of sustained consanguineous reproduction in humans. Medical journals published multiple papers analyzing the genetic data collected from the family. Dr. Eleanor Phillips's comprehensive 1975 study, based on blood samples and family history, became a landmark text in human genetics and is still referenced in medical education today. The research revealed several critical findings about inbreeding depression in human populations. First, it demonstrated that genetic damage accumulates over generations when consanguineous reproduction continues without the introduction of outside genetic material. The Blackwoods were not simply the result of one incestuous union, but rather the compounding effect of 5 generations of such unions, each generation inheriting and magnifying the genetic problems of the previous one. Second, the study identified specific recessive genetic disorders that had become fixed in the Blackwood population. These included several metabolic disorders, connective tissue abnormalities, and neurological conditions that would normally be rare in the general population. In the Blackwoods, these disorders affected nearly every individual because both parents in each generation carried the same harmful recessive genes. Third, the research documented the progressive loss of genetic diversity within the family. By comparing blood samples across generations, researchers could track how the genetic variation that existed in Ezekiel and Margaret had been systematically eliminated through repeated inbreeding. By the sixth generation, family members had less genetic diversity than is typically found in laboratory mice bred specifically for genetic uniformity. The psychological and sociological aspects of the Blackwood case also attracted significant academic attention. Anthropologists studied how the family had developed their own microculture, complete with unique language elements, social structures, and belief systems. The family represented a kind of social experiment, though an unintentional and tragic one, showing how human societies evolve when completely isolated from outside influences. Ethicists debated the intervention itself. Had authorities been right to remove the children from their parents? While the medical arguments were clear, the ethical questions were more complex. The Blackwood adults had not chosen their genetic inheritance or their circumstances. They were victims as much as their children were. Yet allowing children to remain in such damaging conditions seemed equally unconscionable. The case highlighted the tension between respecting family autonomy and protecting vulnerable individuals from harm. The 8 children removed from the family in 1972 had varied outcomes over the following decades. 3 died before reaching age 30 from complications related to their genetic conditions and congenital abnormalities. 2 remained in institutional care their entire lives, never achieving sufficient independence to live outside supervised settings. 1, a girl named Rebecca, who had been 10 years old at the time of removal, made the most progress. With intensive education and therapy, she learned to read at a basic level, could perform simple work tasks, and eventually moved into a group home setting where she lived with support staff. She died in 2003 at age 41. Daniel, the eldest of the removed children, lived until 1998. Despite his severe intellectual impairments and physical disabilities, he developed a reputation among caregivers as gentle and affectionate. He never spoke in complete sentences, never learned to read or write, and required assistance with all activities of daily living. But those who cared for him reported that he seemed, in his own way, content. He enjoyed music, particularly simple melodies played on piano, and would rock back and forth in time with the rhythms, a smile on his malformed face. Young Sarah, the most severely affected of the children, remained in intensive medical care throughout her life. She never learned to walk, speak, or care for herself in any capacity. She died in 1989 at age 21 from aspiration pneumonia, a common complication for individuals with her level of impairment. Her entire existence had been one of almost complete dependence and limited awareness, a life that never should have begun, but that caregivers tried to make as comfortable as possible given the circumstances. The last surviving Blackwood adult, a woman named Esther, who had been in her 30s when the family was discovered, lived until 1997. She spent her final years in a nursing home, still speaking her family's dialect that few could understand, still believing that her family had been wronged by the outside world that had torn them apart. She had no surviving children and no other family members. When she died at age 64, she was buried in the town cemetery rather than the family plot in the woods, marking the end of the Blackwood bloodline. The property where the Blackwood family had lived for over a century was eventually abandoned. The crude structures they had built collapsed over time, returning to the forest from which they had been constructed. By the early 2000s, little physical evidence remained of the family that had once lived there. Nature had reclaimed the land, covering the tragedy in green growth and falling leaves. But the lessons of the Blackwood case remained relevant. Medical professionals used the family's history in teaching about the importance of genetic diversity and the risks of consanguineous reproduction. Genetic counselors referenced the case when advising couples who were related about the potential consequences of having children together. Public health officials pointed to the Blackwoods when discussing the importance of preventing isolation and ensuring all communities have access to medical care and education. The case also raised awareness about the continuing existence of isolated populations around the world where inbreeding might be occurring. While the Blackwoods represented an extreme case, researchers identified other communities, particularly in remote mountainous regions, where limited gene pools and cultural practices of marrying within small groups had led to increased rates of genetic disorders. Public health interventions aimed at introducing genetic diversity and providing education about the risks of close-relation unions became more common. Perhaps most importantly, the Blackwood case humanized a topic that had often been discussed in purely scientific or sensational terms. These were real people who had suffered real consequences from circumstances they did not choose and could not control. They were not monsters or curiosities, but rather victims of a genetic catastrophe that began with one couple's decision in 1838 and rippled forward through generations, causing increasing harm with each passing decade. The photographs taken of the Blackwood family in 1971 and 1972, now held in medical archives with strict privacy protections, serve as stark visual evidence of what can happen when human reproduction occurs within a closed genetic system. The faces in those images, distorted by generations of inbreeding, stare out with eyes that somehow convey both innocence and suffering. These were people who never had a chance at normal lives, who carried in their very selves the accumulated mistakes of their ancestors. Modern genetic science has only reinforced the lessons learned from the Blackwood case. With today's understanding of DNA and heredity, we can precisely calculate the risks associated with various degrees of genetic relatedness. We can identify harmful recessive genes before they manifest in children. We can counsel families about the probability of genetic disorders based on their ancestry. But all of this knowledge came too late for the Blackwoods and families like them. The story of the Blackwood family is ultimately a cautionary tale about isolation, both physical and genetic. When populations cut themselves off from the broader human community, when they turn inward and close their gene pools, the consequences can be devastating and irreversible. The human species thrives on diversity, on the mixing of different genetic lines, on the introduction of new variations that strengthen rather than weaken the population. If you made it to the end of this investigation, you have witnessed one of the darkest chapters in the history of human genetics. This is not just a story from the past, but a reminder that echoes into our present. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can meet you and know who really appreciates the stories on this channel. Hit the like button if this investigation impacted you and opened your eyes to the hidden tragedies that deserve to be remembered. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the real consequences of isolation and genetic closure. Subscribe to this channel because we will continue investigating forbidden stories that society tried to bury, bringing light to cases that need to be known and never forgotten. The Blackwood bloodline ended, but the lessons they left behind must live on.